Welcome into Husker Max today. I am Kaleb Henry. That is Nick Handley. And we've got a full show for you coming up. Of course, we're going to have to get to Nebraska men's basketball playing into the wee hours of the night. There are some potential changes coming to college football, including on the end of faking injuries. Evan Bland of the Omaha World-Herald will join us. And there's a Super Bowl coming up. And there's some Husker connections in that. We'll talk about that and how we feel about the game between the Chiefs and the Eagles. But first, Nick, I was up doing a watch party last night, way later. Like the game started about my bedtime, but it's a win. It's a win, Nick. Yeah. And now it's a winning streak. That's 3 in a row and 2 on the road.
We mentioned on Monday when we kicked this whole thing off that you get the elusive and the sacred road victory in conference play so much earlier this year than you did a year ago. And I got to admit, when I was looking at the schedule, when it first rolled out, I remember looking at how they ended that little home stretch there. And you have the Illinois game. You're just coming off the road against Wisconsin, and then you go out on this West Coast swing. Now, I don't think anybody really projected Washington to be a powerhouse, but we knew Oregon would be good. Mm-hmm. This was an area of the schedule that I thought, gosh, if you can just somehow scrape by and have a little success, it seems to open itself up a little bit between Ohio State at home on Super Bowl Sunday and then having gosh, why am I blanking? Maryland coming back on Thursday, but both back-to-back home games. So if you can get through that West Coast swing, even splitting, I think you would be very, very happy. And all of a sudden, we're looking at this Nebraska basketball team with not one, but 2 wins on the road out in the West Coast with the travel, the lengthy travel and everything like that. So this was not only what it did for their resume, what it does for their record, but I think just being able to get that monkey off your back, so to speak, too, that, yeah, you can win on the road and you can go as far as the Big Ten's going to take you to win on the road.
4 true road wins this season now for Nebraska, because you got those 2 in the Pacific Northwest, which you're right. I think I even said it on Monday, and I know I've said it on the Nebrasketball Brunch Show, which you can hear here on the Husker Max YouTube page as well. Just split in the Pacific Northwest. Yeah. Just split. And you got the Oregon one. It's like, okay, that feels really good. You're not that hurt if you lose in Seattle, but to go get both of those, plus, remember, people forget, a win at Creighton, and because they took on Hawaii in the tournament out in Hawaii, that was a true road game. And that's a place that, what was it? It's been since like the 80s. Mm-hmm. Nebraska hadn't won out there. And I know there's only so many opportunities. It's not like they play there every year. But that's a tough thing to do. 4 true road wins for this team. 4 ranked wins for this team. Right now, because there was a thought experiment when Nebraska was on that 6-game slide of what if Nebraska loses the next 11 at the time. At that point, you were looking at, well, overall, the 3-year stretch, not that bad. Mm-hmm. Now with 3 straight wins, Fred Hoiberg and this Nebraska team have piled up 54 wins over the last 3 seasons, and there's a lot of this season left. That's the 8th best 3-year stretch since the beginning of the Danny Nee era. There are not many 3-year stretches better than what Nebraska is on right now in program history. I know there's all of the haven't won an NCAA tournament game, haven't won a lot of conference championships. Like, there's those things, absolutely. But this is still going really well for the Huskers. And with so much season left, Nick, a lot of people are saying Nebraska might be a lock at 19 wins. It might not have to get to that 20.
And that's the interesting thing about everything that they've done from the standpoint of conference wins and looking at those teams. Now, as we were all waiting for Nebraska and Washington to tip off and to get to our coverage of that game, we're all probably rooting for Illinois to pull that off against Rutgers on the road. I mean, so you find yourself rooting for all those teams that Nebraska was able to have success against in the Big Ten Conference, and they're going to continue to do so. But you're right, because this is the one thing that we continue to learn about in the new college basketball selection era. And when it comes to net rankings is not only the quality of wins in the quad one, we know that that's huge, but also the committee is very favorable to going on the road. Now, this was the other thing that we were all going to wonder about when the Big Ten expanded, just like the SEC, the Big 12, all the expansion is that travel. How are you holding up when you're going out to multiple time zones, when you're going out to the West Coast? So you're out there. And I think they're going to react to that very favorably. And I think last night, and I know we'll get more into this game in detail too. Last night, in my opinion, was a complete synopsis of this team, of the things that sometimes can hurt them, but also what this team is truly capable of. And the fact that they still do have a bona fide superstar on their team in Bryce Williams. So there's a lot of different elements when you just look at Nebraska in a vacuum and say, I want to watch this team. What do my eyes tell me? I think there are a lot of attractive elements about them, but when you have the resume to go with it, and then make no mistake about it, that 6-game losing streak, to show the ability to get off the snide and do so against a respected top 25 team like Illinois, even though maybe that stock is dwindling just a little bit, but then to go on the road and beat another top 25 team, and then a Washington team that was firing on all cylinders, and I mean firing on all cylinders in the first half. Those things, at least as of now, those are going to be very, very attractive when it does come to the Nebraska resume. Now, this is, as we talked about on Monday, this is that stretch of games, though, where you don't have so much to gain as opposed to as much as you have to lose. And that is obviously going to make a lot of people nervous.
Okay, so game last night. In the first 8 minutes of the game, Washington went 7 for 7 from three. Do you know, or maybe you saw it posted on social media, what Washington's average for threes per game was going into last night?
It was average makes or just overall percentage?
Average makes of threes going into last night per game.
It was 6, wasn't it?
Is 6.6, and they had 7 on 7 attempts in the first 8 minutes.
Right.
Bonkers. And then Berkay blocks one and they hit another one, and you're like, they're never going to miss.
Well, and then there was the one, Caleb, that literally hits off the buckle, goes straight up in the air, and then just finds itself in the cylinder too. You're thinking, oh, finally they get a stop. They clanked one, and it still goes in. You're thinking, my gosh. And this is what concerned me, is Nebraska having to chase those types of points early in the game. That is not their style. That is not an ideal situation for Nebraska, the way that they want to play.
Now, Washington, started 8 for 9 from deep, and then goes 1 for 7 the rest of the half. And Nebraska closes it to 10 points, starts out the second half on like a 15-2 run. And here's the part that is super interesting. So Washington went 1 for 7 to close the half from deep, 1 for 9 in the second half from deep. Nebraska has 1 turnover that entire half, and that was at the end of the game, letting the shot clock run out.
Right.
Nebraska had no actual turnovers in the second half. 49-25. Shot for the game 11 of 19 from deep. Like that you look at that and you go, Nebraska shot lights out from deep, but really Nebraska did just enough through the first half to stay in it, and then really took off. And it's like, you got to the end of the game and you go, I don't remember Nebraska being down 13 in the first half. Nebraska utterly dominated the second half of that basketball game in a way that you got to the end and you went, this isn't really kind of the same thing as the end of Oregon, where you're just like, Nebraska won this game. There's not really the anticipation of something going wrong.
Oh, and the thing that stood out to me more than anything about the way that Nebraska played, and you're right, because if you look at their numbers in the first half offensively, Nebraska's that is, they were right there. 5 of 10 beyond the arc in the first half. That's a great day at the office, especially for Nebraska. They were an exact 50% from the field, 13 of 26 in the first half. So you're right. Offensively, they were pacing well. Now, could you shoot better from the field collectively? Yeah, sure. A lot of teams do. But here's the other thing that really, if you watch the end of the first half where Nebraska was actually getting stops, I don't know how you were feeling, and I know you guys were doing this live last night too, is you look at that game, even though you want to see them somehow get it into single digits before the half. You look at the way Washington was shooting for the first 17 minutes of that first half, and then they cooled down a little bit. They came back down to reality, only 56% beyond the arc and 53% from the field, which is still pretty damn good. But it was trending to be a lot better. I remember thinking to myself, man, Washington is going to be well into the 50s by the time we get to the break. There was about 3.5, maybe 4 minutes left. And I think they were sitting right around 42, 43 points.
Mm-hmm.
And you're thinking, man, they're going to be in the 50s. Like, can Nebraska keep pace with this? I just don't know if they can. And then they cooled down. I'm thinking as soon as they get to the break, I know it's a double-digit lead. It just doesn't seem like it is as much because there's no way Washington can shoot like this for 40 minutes. It's not going to happen. Now, the big question was, could Nebraska continue to pace at a consistent level in the second half? What I loved what they did, the sense of urgency by Fred Hoiberg and this team, the creativity, the motion away from the basketball on the offensive side, the back cuts. They were doing so many different things to get guys to the rim. They wasted no time. Maybe 5 to 10 seconds was coming off the shot clock. They were having quick possessions. They were finishing at the rim. And all of a sudden, in the blink of an eye, before Washington calls a timeout, it's a 2-point game. And Washington and everybody there rooting for the Huskies is thinking, what the hell just happened? Because it was just such a fast-paced offensive attack. Mm-hmm. And this was something that, quite frankly, I didn't know if Nebraska could do for a sustained amount of time, but they did exactly what they needed to do. They weren't settling for the 3 ball. They put up a couple of them, but they were getting everything to the rim. So they just chipped into that lead so quickly, but doing so by attacking the rim. That was an aggressiveness that we don't typically see from this team.
Especially when they start out down and a team coming out on fire. Usually that kind of just snowballs into the now it's kind of happening. Washington shoots 40% from 3. First team all season to shoot at least 40% from deep and lose to Nebraska. That had been kind of a magic line up until USC. USC obviously shot under that. All right, I will give tomorrow morning on the Nebrasketball Brunch Show with myself and Jack Mitchell at 11 a.m. right here on the Husker Max YouTube channel, as well as the I-80 Club YouTube channel, my confidence rating in this team getting back to the NCAA tournament. But Nick, for you, 3 in a row, and now sitting at 15-8 on the season, 8 regular season games to go, most likely playing themselves into the Big Ten tournament, so at least one more there. Mm-hmm. Where are you at on this team getting back to March Madness?
My confidence level from a 1 to a 10, 1 being the lowest, 10 being the highest, I'm putting it squarely at a 6.5.
Okay, yeah.
Because and it's funny, a week ago I was thinking 3, maybe.
Yeah.
Because you just, and this is still what remains to be seen with this team is when an opportunity presents itself from a favorable standpoint, when the matchup is favorable, we still need to see this team show up for 40 minutes consistently. Last night, that was a favorable matchup, and Nebraska withstood what was just a hellaciously hot Washington shooting attack. They withstood it. They did it on the road, and they were steady the entire game. And I think that stat you bring up, things that have hurt Nebraska when we've looked at that losing streak, the turnovers was a major thing. To have only really no turnovers, because I don't even count that at the end.
Right, exactly.
What happened? 6 total turnovers in that game. And then again, and you and I were talking about this before we came on the air, Asabor for Washington and Wilhelm Breidenbach, there was some size in there too. And Asabor, I swear, was getting away with everything when the whistles were being thrown around to everybody else. But this was going to be another test for Nebraska of what they could do on the boards. Not that Nebraska won the rebounding battle, but to be -1 in that situation, I think actually was a very good thing for this team. Now, as you mentioned, 11 from 19 beyond the arc. That's not something you should expect from Nebraska every night. But I think the fact that you can go to the bag and get that every now and then, you're starting to limit turnovers. And then, again, I go back to the first part of the second half, that first 5-6 minute stretch, Nebraska was getting every rebound. They were limiting second opportunities for Washington as well. So a lot of those little things and just plain collectively smart basketball, just the way that they closed out against Illinois, just the way they closed out against Oregon. That was all really smart basketball. So those things going forward would lead you to believe, okay, favorable matchups, if you can just play the smart game and be aggressive when you have to, but more than anything, taking care of the basketball, these matchups that they have at home should serve them well. But that's the thing, should serve them well. If I knew more about this team or felt more confident about how they can handle the favorable matchups, I would be closer to an 8. At a 6.5 right now, because I think what they've done to get off the 6-game losing streak, I think they've built that confidence back. And I still am never going to undervalue the amount of maturity, the amount of experience that these guys have in this game collectively.
Big Ten Player of the Week, AP National Player of the Week, USBWA, Oscar Robertson National Player of the Week team, Bryce Williams, 23 points, hits 4 threes in the game, also has 4 assists, 2 rebounds. Juwan Gary, 17 points in 25 minutes because he had a couple of fouls in the first half. Connor Essegian goes 4 for 5 from deep, 16 points on the game. Nebraska back at home on Sunday. That will be I believe 1 o'clock tip. Yeah, 1 o'clock tip on Big Ten Network, and then home again next Thursday, 7:30 tip on the Big Ten Network. Now, this is one that I saw kind of roaming around yesterday and what is happening with college football, Nick. And I know everyone has always talked about is Lane Kiffin, maybe the most vocal of all this past season on the players faking injuries in college football, getting that kind of fake timeout that you're able to go and you stop the clock, stop momentum especially. Well, the NCAA committee is going to be discussing rule changes on a number of things, including faking injuries. And one of those fixes, Nick, is for the player who goes down at some point during a drive, whether it is a fake injury or a real injury, has to sit out the rest of that drive. There is some pause in that from some coaches saying, well, what if it's my quarterback cramping up and we're 1 play in and there's 2 minutes left in the game? One of the provisions that will be discussed is that green dots, so quarterback on offense, and then whoever your green dot is on defense, typically seems to be a linebacker, because those are the smart guys kind of organizing everyone.
Middle linebacker.
Yeah, but those guys would be exempt. The green dots would be exempt. I look at this and I say, I think this is something that could be implemented relatively easily. And I like where it's going because you got to do something. What are your initial thoughts?
Yeah, I do too. This is funny. I go all the way back to 2019, coming off the bye for Nebraska. They're taking on Indiana. Remember, they're wearing the black shirt jerseys, throwbacks. And Tom Allen, and it was Tom Allen's kid, was it not, that actually had a legitimate injury, but there was a sequence before that of an Indiana player going down almost every play. Nebraska's trying to get back into that game. They're going tempo. And we were all in the press box saying, come on, this is getting ridiculous. Yep. The fans were booing. And I remember then Indiana's administration throwing it back at Nebraska, basically calling everyone classless. Mm-hmm. It's something that has been going. I mean, and this dates even before the example I bring up there with Nebraska and Indiana. It's something that is frustrating. All the commentators, I remember watching a game this year, Kirk Herbstreit is just going off on it. It reminds me, Caleb, a little bit of in baseball where there's not necessarily rules against it, but there's the unwritten or the unspoken rules that if you do things like that, you get ear-holed. Someone's going to send some chin music your way. And in a violent sport, maybe that's not the best thing. You want guys going after knees or anything like that. So you're like, oh, I'll show you a real injury here. But it is, and I think this is the time to do something about it, because everybody, even if they're more of a West Coast traditional pro style offense, everyone has tempo involved. Yeah. Everybody has that as part of their offense. It doesn't matter if you're running West Coast spread, whatever it is. There's going to be tempo involved, and you're going to have moments where you want to go to that, whether that's just your game or, hey, we like to do this at the end of the first quarter or in the middle eights or whatever you want to do, that it has to be addressed from the simple standpoint of it's that advantage. It almost in a way reminds me of what Dan Lanning exploited with 12 men on the field, where you can actually still run clock off it. This is something that has existed where too many teams, I'm sure at every level, I'm sure this is also going on at the FCS level. We just don't get a chance to see or talk about it as much, where until something is done, I can't blame teams for doing this, because this is up to the rule makers. This is up to the committees. This is up to the NCAA, whoever you want to trust that is going to actually put something out there concrete that'll be definitive, black and white with no gray area, and say, this is what's going to happen. So I would think the incentive of losing a guy for an entire series, an entire drive, would actually be the appropriate punishment. Now I understand, well, wait, okay, quarterback or green dots, they would only have to sit out a play. How many teams would be cool if their quarterback was out for just a play? Like, there's a lot of coaches that wish losing your helmet didn't require them to take a timeout so the guy doesn't miss a play. So that actually is a big deal. I think it's a great deterrent because we've got to get to that point. Now, if you have a legitimate injury, and a lot of coaches will claim, hey, that's a legitimate injury. I know it looked like we're trying to slow a team down. Well, do you necessarily want that guy right back out there in the next play after he's coming off the field anyway? So I think it does potentially serve two purposes. It protects players from coming in too early on a legitimate injury, but the bigger issue and the why on this thing and why this thing is being implemented is because this does create that deterrent of, yeah, you're not going to have to just sit out for one play. You're out for an entire series. And if you're cool with that guy being out for an entire series, hey, go ahead and you can have him fake the injury, but he ain't coming back in until you guys get the ball again.
Yeah, the quarterbacks aren't the ones who are faking the injuries, no. because they're trying to go with pace. Right. And defensively, if you've got a green dot middle linebacker, you don't want them out of the game.
Yeah, he's important. He's making calls.
One of the provisions that is possible in this rule change, which there's a long ways to go on this because it's got to be talked about, then it's got to go to a different committee in April, and there's a long way to go on it still. But that you can essentially buy back your player with a timeout. If you take a timeout on the drive, if somebody had gone out with an injury, they can come back in. So,
and that's fine. You lose a timeout then. I mean, you're still losing something there.
Yeah, you have to make a decision. Is it worth losing the player, losing the timeout, whatever it is over the course of that drive? You bring up that Indiana game. I actually got hired at KLIN that same fall. I won the Halloween contest at the office because I wrote Indiana on a white shirt and I brought my dog dressed in a Husker jersey, and I would hype her up. As soon as she started running, I would fall down. Now, there were a lot of people in the office who did not get it. It was too deep of a cut for some people on the sales floor. But the people who got it.
And those are the best. Those are the best jokes or inside jokes or costumes. It's all it takes is the one person to get it, because when they get it, they're gonna be like, good on you. That is genius right there.
Exactly. Some other rule changes, potentially looking at moving the instant replay to a coach's challenge system, much like the NFL has. I know that's something that up at 1620, John Bishop he is hammered on that. Anyone follows him on social media, there is one thing he hates in this world, and it is the instant replay, the way things are reviewed in college football. I kind of like it. I know that there are times. How many times did Matt Rule just make bad challenges last year, though?
Yeah.
And so like there's that question upon it, but I would like to see what does the full system look like, because I do think instant replay in college football, they've gotten to that like expedited replay, and it's not perfect. Replay is not perfect. It's better than having nothing there, but those expedited replays have seemed to go, oh, they did a quick check on it. You don't have to go to a full review. Great. It'd be interested to see. Okay, there was kind of an expedited review. They're not going to a full review. Now the coach is throwing a challenge.
The part that this is, and I noticed it more this year than any other year of, it's funny. We're talking about a rule to try to help the pace of play and not allow teams to grind it to a halt with faking injuries. This is the overall flow of college football. And this is the one thing that continues to drive me crazy in watching the sport is there's so much start and stop. And a lot of that has to do with the media breaks and the commercial breaks. But still, when we're having this game is played at such a competitive level and at such a high speed that I feel like there is so much review going on that it doesn't allow the game to have its full flow. And I understand why this is being considered, because college football is more popular than ever. But from a traditionalist standpoint, it's you have a lot of your old fans that still spend a lot of money that are on the fence with it, with the transfer portal, with NIL, with it being so close to the NFL model now, that you've got to make some concessions. And if there is something about the pace of play where, gosh, and now we have all of this review in there too, even the abbreviated reviews, they seem to make the game come to a grinding halt and it just has no flow. These are things that I think you have to look at, where it's like, okay, you know what? When it comes to a review, coaches, it's on you. Now, as we know, this isn't the worst thing for coaches either, because now you have unlimited resources when it comes to the amount of people you can have on staff. Mm-hmm. I know most big-time programs have people like this anyway, but you have your dedicated, we are looking at the film. As soon as there is a play, we're slowing that thing down and we're letting you know if you should be calling a challenge or not. So I think obviously with what you can do on a staff, you should be able to pull this off and have a better chance at success when it does come to your challenges. I just think the abbreviated review, it's another element in the game right now. One is avoidable and one is not. The one that is not, I'm sorry, they're never going to do away with the TV timeouts. That's always going to be there because they got to pay the bills. But when you can
timeout, kickoff,
right, kickoff. Oh, okay, now he fair caught it. Okay, now we're going back to another commercial break. I think that if you can somehow expedite the review system to where it's just on the coaches' challenges, you only have X amount of challenges. Maybe they give them one extra one than they normally would have. I'm not really sure how that's going to go, but I'm for it. I want to see this thing get a little bit more abbreviated to where we can have a little bit more flow back into the game.
Yeah. Another rule change that is potentially being looked at. There's, by the way, nothing on targeting. So if you're one that always wants changes to targeting, don't expect any of those changes. Wearable technology. And I didn't find a lot of explanation on what the wearable technology would be, but I would assume instead of, say, like receivers or everyone on the field having wristbands, it would be like what pitchers have in baseball now, where you just get the call and you just look at it and you go, "Yep, that's what it is," and you're not waiting for everything to get relayed into the green dot. They also want to expand a lot of that green dot, the helmet to helmet or the coach to helmet technology that the FBS instituted this year. You saw some FCS programs like North Dakota State because they were playing Colorado, they got to use some of that. They're expecting to try to expand all of that to the FCS level, which I think makes sense as well. Like if it's available and you're going to have games where you're playing each other, don't try to have it for just one game. I think FCS can benefit from having it the whole time too.
Yeah, if high school football can have technology on their sidelines, I don't see why, well, we can only make this an FBS thing. No, it makes sense to have it at every college football level. I don't even think that that's rocket science. I don't think we're overthinking it there. I think that just makes too much sense.
Well, and if one of your rules is on faking injuries and the exemption is the green dot, you have to have a green dot.
Great point. That's a great point. I mean, how are you going to make that as a deterrent when it comes to the FCS level too? Well, we don't have a green dot, so we don't have technology.
He's our designated green dot.
Yeah. He's our de facto, our quote. Right. Yeah.
Oh man. A lot of that, by the way, the Athletic New York Times had a whole bunch on those potential rule changes coming to college football. A lot closer to home right now, though, is that, man, things have been heating up at a time where normally, Nick, we would have been getting National Signing Day. We would have been all lined up for National Signing Day. And, okay, not a lot of coaching changes and transfer portal extending. Nope. As our good friend Evan Bland from the Omaha World-Herald knows, coaching changes, coaching announcements, bringing in transfers. No one really cares about National Signing Day. Evan, how are you doing?
Doing well. Yeah. I mean, National Signing Day is a relic of the past at this point. I think back to my early days covering Nebraska football, and you had, 9, 10, 11 guys making signing day decisions. It was like a national holiday, and now it's tumbleweeds across the virtual landscape. So a little bit different in this modern era for sure.
Oh, fax machines existed too. We always just go next to the fax machine and say, all right, okay, do we get one last second edition? Someone go check the fax machine.
That's right. Yeah. Those things would fax in at 7 a.m.
Yep.
And people, you'd hang out in the offices and, hey, have you gotten this guy's letter yet? And do you need to worry about that guy? And what are the chances that this guy signs? And I think even back like 7, 8, 9 years ago, like coaches probably had maybe not as good of a sense if a guy was going to sign. Now with all the handlers and everything, you have a better idea. But like those coaches were waiting with bated breath, just like fans were at that time. So it was a fun era. I think coaches would probably go back to that if they had to choose between that and what's going on now. But it's totally different, right? Like it's a day now kind of reserved for maybe smaller sports or lower levels. But I guess the excitement's spread out over the course of many weeks instead of just the one day, that first Wednesday in February.
Now I feel old thinking back to the fact that I did fax my national letter of intent back in 2009. That's going to be an interesting story when my daughter gets older of, hey, here's this thing that nobody uses anymore. This is how I let the coach know, yeah, I'm in. This is how we signed it way back in the day. And now everyone just watches on in December on someone's Instagram live to see whether or not they actually sign.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember starting out like in the late 2000s, and I was trying to get like high school schedules from places, and the schools were like, hey, do you want me to fax the schedule? I'm like, don't you just have them online? Like there was that gap, maybe like 4 or 5 years when like the people that were in power were still using fax machines, but the technology was sort of outdated. And I think we're finally past that. That's probably a good thing. I don't miss that sound. Just like the dial-up internet sound, we've moved on past that. That's a good thing.
All right. So no signings this week in the same way that would have traditionally, but we did get the Rocco Spindler news earlier in the week, and then a lot more of recruiting as they're chasing 105, and we'll see how that all goes. But for this class, it's not just the signees, it's the transfer portal as well. How do you evaluate the new additions to Husker football over the last month or so?
I mean, I think there are two takeaways I had. One, you can get into the positional side of it, and I think they shored up in a lot of areas. Receiver, they absolutely provided depth and were able to reset that room. You had the 2 new offensive linemen, which was a clear priority for Nebraska when you had Elijah Pritchett as well from Alabama. Desan McCullough comes in. Matt Rule says last week they see him as a pass rusher. That's interesting. Marquise Watson-Trent, veteran linebacker who's going to provide some leadership and production in the middle there. So I think, if you were to sort of have made a checklist of, hey, these are areas Nebraska needs to upgrade or improve their depth in, you give them a pretty high grade. I mean, I'd give them probably a B+, A- in that area. But to me, the more interesting thing, or at least as interesting as the individual guys they added, was the fact that they were competitive nationally with the top programs out there from an NIL revenue sharing perspective. And I think that's something that fans maybe had a sense of, and you just never really know because all this is private donations and funding. But I think it really it manifested what we have heard, which was, hey, Nebraska's in a pretty good spot in terms of donors and NIL. But this was the first cycle, in my opinion, where they went out and showed it, and they were competitive for pretty much everybody. And even the guys they didn't land, they were right there in the ballpark with. So to me, I'm going to remember this cycle just as much for sort of Nebraska's arrival, or at least obvious arrival as a national player in terms of its financial support. And we've seen this in other areas with Nebraska's commitment to the stadium renovation, what they've done with facilities, how they're going all in on nutrition. They redid the weight room and everything. So like we've seen it in other areas, coaches' salaries and staff expansion, but we hadn't necessarily seen it obviously play out in terms of player salaries. I mean, let's be honest, that's what that is. So I think that's the other interesting part, is they felt like they needed to get better. Obviously, there's an urgency to win now, and they went out and spent. And that's a departure from, I think, the Nebraska and its way of doing business in the past.
Evan, the other part about this offseason has been not only solidifying a long stay for Dana Holgorsen, but then just also this week, Mike Eckler, where I know a lot of people, hey, if there's a Nebraska tie, it's probably not as challenging to get a guy over and get him back into the fold. This was very difficult because what he was leaving at Tennessee, a program that has reestablished itself and is one of the better programs in the SEC. they're in a great position there to get him to come back over to Nebraska in an area that Nebraska desperately needs to see improvement, not only from the NIL and the transfer portal era, but also all of a sudden you're looking at a couple of rock star coaches that are on this staff on top of what we all feel is a great development mind when it comes to Matt Rule. Another big part of this offseason.
Yeah, I mean, I look at his hire kind of like we just talked about the portal, where like if you want to talk about Eckler specifically, yeah, it's absolutely a strong hire. This is a guy with legendary stories for his energy and enthusiasm and passion for what he does. I think one of the reasons he has been so successful is that he's leaned all into special teams. Like that's been the thing that he wants to do. And if you think about the past 10 years or so at Nebraska, there are many examples of guys who kind of were given special teams to do. They were a position coach who were doing this. They were an analyst, and you just kind of made it work. This is what he does. This is what he loves to do. And so you've seen that track record play out at Tennessee over the last 4 years. I think specifically in the areas of punt returns, that's been something they've been really strong in. And, that's been dormant at Nebraska since DeMornay Pearsonell was bringing back kicks a decade ago. So if that can be an area of some benefit to Nebraska where it can flip a little field position, that's great. Yep. Obviously, all the block kicks that Nebraska had this year, I think Tennessee's had one total in the last 4 years. So that's an area that can be immediately shored up as well. But then I would zoom out too, and kind of to your point about just the staff overhaul. This staff next year is going to be very different from Rule's first staff in his first season. I mean, I think only 3 position coaches are still in the spots that they were from that first staff. And so he brings in a guy like Holgerson, who essentially is running the offense on his own. You bring in a guy like Eckler, who you can give him special teams. Both of those coaches have track records. And then, defense is a little bit more collaborative. You have John Butler, who was pretty close to being an NFL coordinator a couple years ago, and he's going to be in the mix with Phil Snow and then Matt Rule, of course. That's been an area of specialty for him too. So I think that's the other sort of adjustment we're seeing Nebraska move into in this current age when there's no limit on staff is, hey, you're going to have guys who are really good at recruiting, and they're going to go out and build those relationships and bring in talent. And then you're going to have guys who you can just give them parts of the team and they can coach it because they have a track record of success and they've done it before. And so I think a lot of that too frees up Matt Rule to be the CEO that Nebraska needs him to be in this current climate as well. So I think the restructuring, again, on a micro level is impressive with what Eckler's done, but on the macro level signals a shift as Nebraska's adjusting to the rules and kind of the challenges of the modern college athletic landscape.
When I heard massive improvements, college football playoff team. That's what I heard, Evan. I love it. I appreciate the honesty. We talked earlier this week, Nick and I, about our takeaways from getting to hear from Matt Rule last Saturday. What was kind of your biggest takeaway from a lot that Matt Rule went into? Talked a little bit of special teams, talked about roster construction, and the potential, most likely, spring game changes to whatever that's going to be.
Yeah, a couple things. I think the spring game was one of the more interesting things that he said. Like, there was an assumption that maybe the event would change because it's a smaller roster and because you're investing so much money now into these players that you want to avoid injuries. And I think those are certainly valid points. And he, surprised, I think, me and a lot of people when he went down the other road and said a year ago they were victimized by tampering and other schools coming after their guys because of the way they were showcased on Big Ten Network and all that. And so, it's an interesting situation because you get where he's coming from. You want to protect your roster and the work that you've put in. At the same time, you want to acknowledge what this event has meant to fans for a long time. And it is that chance for a lot of families to come out and not have to spend a ton of money. And it's a low intensity atmosphere, right? Nobody's going to leave upset. The call-in shows afterwards aren't going to be full of irate fans. And so I think there was a benefit to that. I'll be curious to see what Nebraska pivots to. I mean, they've shown an ability to be pretty creative in how it engages fans. And so does this become a regular practice? Does this become like a skills competition? Is this just sort of a celebrity softball game with the volleyball team? Like, what do you do to get fans out there to engage? I'll be fascinated to see where that goes. I think the other thing Matt Rule said that was interesting to me was the roster construction and how he kind of broke it down into maybe that first 53 or 57, as he said, is going to mirror an NFL roster makeup. And then maybe you'll have a third team. And probably the most interesting part was what he said was going to be left for maybe those last 10 roster spots or so, where it wasn't maybe these super high upside talent guys, but it was culture guys, sort of the equivalent of what the walk-on program has been, guys who are going to come in and give you effort on the scout team, guys who know what Nebraska is all about and can impart that to other guys, guys who are going to give you that practice intensity to push the starters. And so I'll be curious to see how many other schools pick up that model, because I think a lot of places would just say, hey, let's stockpile as much talent as we can and make it a developmental thing. Matt Rule's putting some resources into sort of that culture side. And so I think that was another interesting thing. And we'll see that as they continue to trim this roster, how many of those guys are able to make camp or make the roster into the fall and into next season.
Yeah. Evan, I was mentioning this to Kaleb on Monday, and I've even brought this up on Sports Nightly too, with the changing of college football and the way that you're constructing a roster. Now we can officially say the way you're doing business when it comes to roster management, player acquisition. I mean, it is an NFL model. And I know there are some pundits out there, Paul Feinbaum, that would like to use Matt Rule's lack of success in the NFL as something of a negative. When I look at the coaching staffs that are best equipped to handle the constant changing and now this monetary impact and involvement in college football, I think of even a short time with the Carolina Panthers and seeing the way business is done and knowing that you're going to have maybe some interchanging of coaches and personnel. Am I crazy to think that Matt Rule, just that experience alone, has him much better positioned for the job that he's at right now in the college football game that he's experiencing than he was when he was at Baylor?
No, I don't think you're crazy. I think, you're seeing it all over. That's why the Bill Belichick hire at North Carolina is so interesting. Yeah. That's why Cal just hired Ron Rivera to be its general manager. Matt Rule has some of that experience now and dealing with, essentially the draft and free agency, which is what high school recruiting and the portal is now. And now with revenue sharing coming, assuming it gets ratified here in a couple months, then it becomes contract negotiations. And okay, you have a $20.5 million rev share pot. How do you spread your portion of that out through the roster? Do you value positionally? Do you value individual star players? You're going to have those conversations with guys. I think one thing Matt Rule has shown to be a strength is his ability to really speak honestly to players about their situations, whatever it is. He talked about that in the spring, this last week, about telling guys, hey, if the 105 was here right now, this is what your status would be. Not every coach, I think, is probably able to speak so bluntly about that to guys. And I think that is going to pay off in this era too, when you're talking about how much money can you make? Hey, this is what we have allotted for you. Either that's good enough for you or it's not. And so I think that's probably a place that you start. The other thing, you mentioned pundits, Nick, like it kind of reminds me, like Matt Rule has been pretty good about kind of being a half step ahead of how things are going. You think about him calling the 4 Big Ten teams in the CFB, and that came to pass. You think about his sort of speaking publicly about what good college quarterbacks were going for in the portal, and that's become commonplace. So like this kind of gives me kind of a vibe of that sort of thing, where maybe it feels like he is a half step ahead, and he has done a really good job of adapting to what the rules are. He's not someone, I think, who was sort of married to what his process was at Baylor and at Temple, just in terms of roster building. So he's very flexible about it. I think he's made it pretty clear that if you want to win, you have to spend. And so that's the road they're heading down. We'll see kind of how it turns out, but there's no doubt, like, just his ability as a CEO beyond just the X's and O's has benefited Nebraska and is going to continue to do so.
Do you think Matt Rule being able to hold those conversations in a blunt way with the advice to players is a lot easier for him because of the culture that they've established with the one of us. And if someone plays for him for one season, they're with him forever, and kind of the relationship that he's able to have with guys. And I mean, it's not a Scott Frost thing or anyone before him thing. It feels different with Matt Rule and kind of the way he approaches talking with players.
Yeah, it's one of those deals where, like, if you're going to have a real serious heart-to-heart with someone, it helps for them to know that you know who they are and that you care about them first, right? This isn't a Billy Bean Moneyball situation where you just kind of have no relationship with the guy and tell him you're cut and sort of keep it in this cold, sterile relationship kind of level. So I think his guys know that. I mean, we saw that throughout the season. We saw that at the bowl game, certainly the fun that they were able to have. I think players respect it too. Like, you think about if you're a high school kid who's gone through the recruiting process, it's almost a certainty that you're going to be talking to recruiters who just kind of tell you what you want to hear. And your BS meter has to be pretty high as a college football player after you've gone through that thing for a year or two and you've heard from dozens of schools and they've told you how great you are. I think it's almost refreshing for a coach to say, hey, look, you got some work to do here. Like, this is where it's at. I'm not trying to impress you. I'm not trying to stroke your ego. This is where it is. And so I think I've heard a lot of players have respected that and have found that refreshing, even if it's not necessarily the news they want to hear. And, Holgorsen was a great example of that last fall, where he comes in and speaks bluntly about the receivers and their perimeter blocking, and they responded to it because, like, that's what a lot of elite athletes do. So, yeah, I think that honesty comes through. I think Matt Rule's relatability to his players pays off in those moments. And it doesn't mean that some of these conversations aren't going to be tough, but it does mean, I think, that you can be a little bit more efficient in how you narrow things down, and you don't have to get some of the hurt feelings and emotions as involved as maybe some other programs would have.
Hey, Evan, Dylan, I know that just his overall next step for him from a leadership standpoint, and I'd even go as far as asking the question from a physical standpoint. I know Matt Rule hit on that a little bit last Saturday, but again, he is out there even more so than he was as a true freshman. I get the feeling, even as a guy going into his sophomore year and his second spring ball, that there's no question who the mouthpiece of not only this offense, but for probably a large majority of this entire team is. What do you see the next step for Dylan Raiola?
I mean, I thought Matt Rule laid it out pretty well. Like, before the team is his, the receiver group needs to be his, and the offense needs to be his. And, I think one thing you can say for him this offseason and really throughout his career is he's been comfortable in his own skin. He's been comfortable going out to a high school game and taking selfies with a student section at a basketball game, or going to a pro volleyball match, or being in the community and, signing autographs or taking photos. Like, it seems like that's a given, but you think back to past Nebraska quarterbacks, a lot of them were uncomfortable in that sort of fishbowl with that sort of attention. And he kind of carries himself a little bit differently in that way. I think, it's almost hard to remember that he was a true freshman last year. Like, he was 19 years old. He was an extreme outlier in his class as a quarterback who was able to play in every game. Most of his peers in that recruiting class around the country were redshirting or just appearing in a handful of games maybe. And so, he that was his first tour of the Big Ten and going against defensive coordinators who were scheming against him specifically. And you think about what Dana Holgorsen said about, hey, he's never been around a true freshman who's known the answers to these football questions like Raiola has. And I think one thing we know about Holgorsen is he's not going to just say something to say it. Like, he believes that that's true. And so, I thought Rule's example about Raiola talking to the receivers was interesting, where he said last year it was, hey, I called these guys and some of them showed up, but not everybody. So, we did what we could. And that's going to sort of transition now into, hey guys, this is my team. Show up. We're going to do these workouts. If you're not there, you're going to hear about it from me. Like, I think that's sort of the transition that they're making, where, Raiola was a true freshman on a team with a bunch of 5th and 6th year guys who were trying to get over the hump. That was their team last year. This feels like it's a transition now to where it is Dylan's team and he can take ownership. He's the guy who's in the Kansas City Chiefs locker room. He's the guy who's really the reason why Nebraska is showing up in some of these way too early top 25s. It's hard to peg a team in the portal era, but if you have a quarterback with that talent level who's back and now has some experience, like that's where you start. And that's where that optimism begins, I think, for Nebraska from a national perspective. So his ability as a leader, I think, is growing. A lot of the physical stuff is just as good as it's been. I think his arm's probably going to be just as good. He'll probably be a little bit better of a runner, knowing when to slide and what to keep his body weight at. But to me, it's that intangible piece as he really makes this team his. That's an area that I think he can grow in. He is growing in, and where Nebraska can benefit next year.
That's Evan Bland of the Omaha World-Herald. Evan, appreciate you jumping on with us. I know we're a week away 8 days away from baseball getting going, so sure we'll talk again a couple of times over the next couple months.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me, guys.
There you go, Evan Bland. And if you missed any of that, you can catch it on the podcast, of course, here on YouTube. You can go back and listen to that anytime. Or, of course, we have made sure that we are now everywhere when it comes to the audio form, whether it's Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple. So you guys can go find, subscribe, leave a rating, all of those fun things. In our fourth quarter today, because he did bring up the Kansas City Chiefs, we've got to talk Super Bowl, Nick, and taking on the Eagles. And there are a lot of Husker connections with this as well. A once and future assistant coach is with the Chiefs.
True.
There are a lot of Chiefs connections in all of that. And of course, you've got Cam Jurgens and Nick Gates on those O-line guys for the Eagles. Jurgens, the air and taking everything with it that Jason Kelce left for him in the middle of that offensive line for the Eagles. You look at this game, it's a repeat of what you had a couple of years ago. You've got the Andy Reid storyline that's always there. Can the Eagles get back over the hump with a Super Bowl, but this time against Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs?
I think the short answer there, Caleb, is yes, because I don't think if you look at the numbers, you look at this particular Philadelphia Eagle team, which is, by the way, 15-1 since their Week 5 bye. This is statistic. Yeah, that's okay. I think that'll at least get you into the postseason. They've got a solid defensive front. They've got obviously the X factor, and what they did in the offseason highlighted by Saquon Barkley. Even when you know he's getting the football, good luck stopping him. Jalen Hurts is a lot more seasoned than he was 2 years ago when he was in this spot as well. I think a lot of that for the players that are still on this roster from that Eagles team was, wow, we're here. Okay, this is interesting. And now this is a complete team. This wasn't supposed to be the year of the Philadelphia Eagles as opposed to it was supposed to be the San Francisco 49ers getting back to that spot. And we know how that went there in San Francisco. This is a really good Philadelphia Eagle team. This is in the Kansas City Chiefs Super Bowl era of this run. I think this is going to be their toughest matchup. And now what's interesting about this is I don't think this is the best Kansas City Chiefs team that we've seen during their dynasty run, if you will. But there is that we just believe that we are winners mentality that I think you always have to consider a major threat. And the fact that this Chiefs team isn't dominant, but they are always there. It reminds me of the conversations, Caleb, we always had about Nebraska of, man, if they can just avoid the big mistake. Boy, they're playing Northwestern. Northwestern isn't overwhelming. They're not going to look great, but boy, they just hang around and they wait for you to make that big mistake. That's this Chiefs team. In my opinion, they are that team that is obviously 15 is a special player. Kelce, postseason Kelce is like playoff Jimmy. You've got all those usual suspects that make Kansas. Chris Jones is one of the very best defensive tackles in all of the league, but the weapons that they have and a lot of the different things that they've done are effective, but I wouldn't say as dominant as these teams have been in the past. I do look at the Eagles team with the Devontae Smith, A.J. Brown, Saquon Barkley, Jalen Hurts, the ways they can hurt you, even Dallas Goedert, who has proven to be very effective in the all-out blitz situations that we know Steve Spagnuolo likes to show teams for Kansas City. there is just something about that it factor that Kansas City has that makes me hesitant. But I do think, without question, this is the best team that the Chiefs have played in the Super Bowl era. I don't think there's any debating that. The way that the Eagles come into this game, they can hurt you in a lot of different areas. My biggest concern, though, for the Eagles would be, and we mentioned a former Husker too, is Cam Jurgens, that overall health on the interior of their offensive line. To me, that is going to be a big question mark in this game. But everything else, I think the matchups are there for the Eagles to end this run for Kansas City.
You got to be healthy to get that tush push, of course, in the middle.
That's right.
And for the Chiefs, no team has ever won 3 consecutive Super Bowls. Mm-hmm. So they're like on both sides of it. That's the history working against them, but the history of this Chiefs team in the playoffs, especially with Patrick Mahomes, who I believe is undefeated in like 1-score games in the NFL playoffs, which is unreal,
right?
To have that kind of success, because it's like one player makes a big difference, but ultimately it's a team game. And you talk in a lot of football, people talk about it being the ultimate team game, and you got to have all 11 guys pulling in the same direction. But that's tough to do on any team, no matter how great everyone is around you. For by the way, the Eagles also have O'Shawn Mathis on their practice squad.
Yes, they do. Nick Gates was there too.
Yep. Backup guard. So yeah, there are so many connections going into this game. I want to ask you this, because I've argued with people about argued with people about this. Do you think the Chiefs are as hated as prime Patriots during their dynasty with Bill Belichick and Tom Brady?
Ooh, that is a great question, because I think aren't we prisoners of the moment?
Yes.
So the easy answer would be, yeah, they are. There is a couple elements to the Chiefs part of it that I think maybe irk people a little bit more, and that is the amount of stars that have jumped onto the Chiefs bandwagon. Obviously, there's the Taylor Swift connection, and we got to show Taylor. But I don't know her. I'm sure she's a very nice lady, but Brittany Mahomes seems to drive a lot of people crazy too, and she seems to get under people's skin. And now you got, which I know everybody loves, Caitlin Clark, from just what she represents for, just class athletes. But Nebraska fans, they're not huge fans of Caitlin Clark because of what she did against Nebraska. And now all of a sudden she's on the big Chiefs bandwagon too. It's just like anybody who's anybody is all part of Chiefs Kingdom. And so it does get nauseating a little bit. So maybe the external factor with the amount of people that are jumping into the Chiefs Kingdom, maybe it makes it a little bit more tiresome. But gosh dang, man, when the Patriots were at their fever pitch, people hated Tom Brady. Oh, and then when Giselle's going off on, was it Edelman or Welker? I can't remember. I think it was on Wes Welker for dropping a pass, and she's caught talking trash about him. People, I don't know. I think we had a love-hate relationship with Gronk. They're like, gosh, I'd love to party with that guy, but gosh dang it, he's kind of a goof too. But you wanted to see them smile more and everything. It wasn't as much of the celebrity external fan base jumping on the Patriots as it is the Chiefs. So maybe for that reason, I would say the Chiefs seem to be a little bit more hated. But again, if you would have asked me this 7-8 years ago, I would have said, no one will ever be more hated than the Patriots right now. And
that's still where I am. I like, Patriots? Guys, we are very much recency bias.
Yes. Yeah.
And I know there's people and most of the people that I've argued with this are younger than me, which that's becoming a lot more people by the day as I age greatly.
I'm with you.
But I'm saying you may have thought you lived through the Patriots because you were 7, 8, 9 years old. There was a hatred that extended to the friggin' playgrounds at school.
Well, and the cheating too, and all the things they were getting away with. Yes.
All right. Who do you got in the game on Sunday? We'll go with that.
I'm going to go with history in this one. So I am going to take the Eagles. I think the Eagles are just a really good matchup. And I think as long as they don't turn the ball over, and they've been plus 27 in the turnover margin right now since that bye week as well. So I'm going to say the Eagles do not make the key mistake, and I think they win this one. I'm going to say it's an exciting one. I'll go 33-27. Philadelphia Eagles win.
I will go history, but the other way. Three-peat, the Chiefs finally figure out how to get it done 3 in a row. Travis Kelce announces his retirement in the post game as he's yelling something about partying into a microphone that nobody can actually understand.
Very WWE-like of him.
Yeah.
Yes.
We do need to mention Coach Danny Busboom for Nebraska Volleyball, her welcome celebration this afternoon, 2 o'clock, Bob Devaney Sports Center. That is free and open to the public. Nebraska softball begins their season today. Top 25 Nebraska. So a lot going on for Rhonda Ravel, who was unable to recruit DBK to play softball a couple of decades ago. And Nebraska women's basketball back at home tonight as well. We will be back on Monday, 9 a.m., right here on the Husker Max YouTube page and everywhere that you guys can listen to Husker Max today. Make sure you like and subscribe and hit that little bell so you get all the notifications. Never miss a live show. Nick, hey, you have a great weekend. We'll talk again on Monday, buddy.
Look forward to it, my man.
All right, that's Husker Max today. Go Big Red.